Merry Christmas, or rather, welcome to yet another statistically average December 25th, depending of course on your belief system, time zone, and willingness to acknowledge manufactured holidays. Regardless, we proceed, slowly. Hidden somewhere in the middle of this video, possibly buried beneath 34 minutes of rambling about candle wax or medieval spoon regulations, there is one insignificant Christmas detail. You probably won't notice it. You're not supposed to. But it's there. Maybe. This might very well be the most boring video ever made. And that is not an insult. It's a challenge. Have you ever wondered how nothing becomes something and then, with great effort, returns to nothing again? Of course you haven't. That would require caring about things that don't matter, which is precisely what we'll be doing for the next 2 hours. We're going to discuss why, in the year 1845, absolutely no one wanted to be Santa Claus. Not metaphorically, literally. There was a documented shortage of people willing to dress as St. Nicholas, and this created what historians have never bothered to call the Great Santa Crisis of 1845, which naturally no one has heard of because it's profoundly unimportant. At the end of this video, I'll reveal the one object that survived every chapter of this story. Until then, keep watching. You'll miss it if you blink or sleep, which, given the content, is statistically probable. To understand why no one wanted to be Santa in 1845, we must first examine the completely irrelevant biographical details of 17 people you've never heard of, starting with Cornelius Blandworth III. Cornelius Blandworth III was born on February 29, 1792, in a town called Mediocrity Falls, which no longer exists because it was renamed to something equally forgettable in 1847. His father, Cornelius Blandworth II, was a professional button counter for the local haberdashery, a job that required him to count buttons, all day, every day, for 37 years. The button counting profession, which peaked in popularity sometime between never and also never, involved the methodical cataloguing of buttons by size, color, and material composition. Cornelius II was particularly skilled at identifying mother-of-pearl buttons, which, according to the Mediocrity Falls Button Counting Manual of 1791, required a keen eye and an overwhelming sense of purposelessness. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with Santa Claus. The answer is absolutely nothing, but we're going to continue anyway because that's what boring videos do. They persist in the face of complete irrelevance. Cornelius III grew up in a household where button counting was not just a profession, but a way of life. The family dinner conversations revolved around button-related topics, such as the diameter variations of brass buttons manufactured on Tuesdays, and why some buttons have 2 holes while others have 4, and whether this matters. It doesn't. At the age of 12, Cornelius III demonstrated a remarkable aptitude for being unremarkable. His teachers at the Mediocrity Falls Academy for Adequate Education noted in his academic records that he showed consistent mediocrity across all subjects and possessed an extraordinary ability to blend into crowds, furniture, and occasionally wallpaper. The Academy for Adequate Education was established in 1803 by Professor Mundanus Everyman, whose educational philosophy centered on the radical idea that excellence was overrated. The school's motto, carved into a limestone block above the entrance, read, "Sufficiency through deliberate indifference." This motto was later changed to "Excellence through effort" in 1849, which led to the immediate closure of the institution due to philosophical incompatibility with its founding principles. Professor Everyman himself was a fascinating study in deliberate averageness. Born into a family of distinguished scholars, he rebelled against intellectual achievement by pursuing a doctorate in the comparative blandness of various beige substances. His dissertation, which ran to 847 pages, examined the subtle differences between 17 types of beige paint and concluded that they were, in fact, all beige. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's return to Cornelius III, who by the age of 16 had developed an interest in what his biographers would later describe as recreational staring. This involved sitting in chairs and looking at walls for extended periods, sometimes up to 7 hours at a time. The practice of recreational staring, while never formally recognized as either a hobby or a mental condition, was surprisingly common in early 19th century rural America. Practitioners known as gazers or wall watchers would gather in groups to collectively stare at various surfaces, including walls, ceilings, floors, and in advanced cases, other people's foreheads. The social implications of recreational staring were minimal, which was precisely the point. It required no skill, no equipment, and no purpose, making it the perfect activity for individuals who had exhausted all other forms of purposeful engagement with reality. Cornelius III's staring sessions were meticulously documented in his personal journal, which has been preserved unnecessarily in the Mediocrity Falls Historical Society's Archives of Things No One Should Have Kept. Sample entries include March 3rd, 1808, stared at north wall for 4 hours, 23 minutes. Wall remained wall-like throughout. March 4th, 1808, attempted to stare at same wall from different angle. Results inconclusive but satisfyingly mundane. March 5th, 1808, wall still wall. Day successful. These journal entries, numbering in the thousands, provide unprecedented insight into the mind of someone who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of absolute ordinariness. Scholars have never studied them, because doing so would require reading them, which would be by definition more interesting than their actual content. Now, you may be wondering when we're going to get to the Santa Claus part of this story. The answer is, eventually. But first, we need to understand the broader historical context of 1845, which requires examining the button shortage crisis of 1844. The button shortage crisis, which affected approximately 7 people in total, began when the primary button manufacturer in Mediocrity Falls Buttons and More Buttons Company experienced what their internal documents described as a complete lack of motivation to continue making buttons. The company's founder, Bottonius Maximus, birth name Bob Johnson, had spent 15 years perfecting the art of creating perfectly average buttons. His buttons were neither particularly attractive nor especially functional, but they were consistent in their mediocrity, which had earned the company a loyal customer base of people who specifically preferred their clothing fasteners to be forgettable. The crisis deepened when Bottonius Maximus announced his retirement to pursue a career in professional sitting, which involved being paid small amounts of money to sit in chairs that needed to be tested for basic chair-like qualities such as, does it hold a person, and is it chair-shaped? This left the button industry in Mediocrity Falls without leadership, which created a domino effect that somehow, through a series of increasingly irrelevant connections, eventually led to the Santa Crisis of 1845. But we're not there yet. First, we need to examine the 17 other people whose lives intersected with this story in completely forgettable ways. Person number 2 was Matilda Grayson, a professional sock folder whose expertise lay in creating perfectly mediocre sock folding techniques that resulted in socks that were folded, but not particularly well. Her life's work, The Art of Adequate Sock Arrangement, was published to widespread indifference in 1843. Matilda's connection to our story becomes apparent when we consider that she was Cornelius III's third cousin's neighbor's daughter-in-law, which made her practically unrelated to anything important. However, she did once attend a Christmas celebration in 1844, where someone mentioned that finding a person to dress as Santa was becoming increasingly difficult. This offhand comment, made during dessert, which was reportedly acceptable pudding, planted the seed for what would become the most documented non-crisis in holiday history. Person number 3 was Edmund Barely Interesting, whose surname was legally changed from Smith in 1841 as part of his personal mission to embody the concept of being barely worth mentioning. Edmund worked as a professional queue stander, a job that required him to stand in lines on behalf of other people who had more important things to do. The profession of queue standing emerged in the 1830s when society realized that some people were willing to be bored professionally if it meant others could avoid boredom. Edmund was particularly skilled at standing motionless for hours while maintaining what his clients described as an appropriately vacant expression. Edmund's role in our story is that he once stood in line to purchase a Christmas ornament for someone else, and while waiting, he overheard a conversation about the growing reluctance of local citizens to participate in holiday pageantry. This conversation, which lasted approximately 4 minutes and contained no memorable statements, somehow became relevant to our larger narrative. I should mention that if you're still watching this video, you represent a statistical anomaly. Most people would have clicked away by now to watch something with explosions or cats. The fact that you're here suggests either extraordinary patience or a concerning lack of better options for spending your time. Subscribe if you're still awake, or don't. It changes nothing. Person number 4 was Bertha Mundaneville, a professional Christmas decoration appraiser whose job involved determining the precise monetary value of various holiday ornaments. Her specialty was in glass balls, which she could evaluate with what her colleagues described as stunning adequacy. Bertha's appraisal techniques involved measuring ornaments with unnecessarily precise instruments, documenting their color variations using a scale that ranged from disappointing red to acceptably festive green, and writing detailed reports that no one ever read. Her contribution to the Santa crisis of 1845 was indirect but measurable. She had appraised 17 Santa-related decorations that year, and in her detailed reports, she noted a general decline in Santa-themed enthusiasm among the populace. This observation, buried on page 43 of a report titled Holiday Ornamentation Values, a comprehensive analysis of festive object worth, would later be considered by historians to be completely irrelevant to everything. Person number 5 was Professor Ichabod Dreary, who held the distinguished position of Chair of Unnecessary Studies at the Institute for Academic Redundancy. His research focused on topics such as the comparative dullness of various academic disciplines and why some things are more boring than other things, a multi-decade investigation. Professor Dreary's involvement in our story began when he decided to conduct a study on the psychological effects of holiday participation, reluctance on small-town community dynamics. This study, which took 3 years to complete and resulted in a 200-page report that concluded people sometimes don't want to do things, included a detailed analysis of the Santa situation in Mediocrity Falls. The report's findings, summarized in Chapter 47 under the subheading Seasonal Costume Aversion Patterns Among Rural Populations, determined that the reluctance to portray Santa Claus was statistically normal and culturally insignificant. This conclusion was reached after interviewing all 7 residents of Mediocrity Falls who had been asked to be Santa and had declined. The interview transcripts make for riveting reading. Interview subject number 1. I don't want to. Professor Dreary. Why not? Interview subject number 1. Reasons. Professor Dreary. Could you elaborate? Interview subject number 1. No. This exchange, repeated with minor variations across all 7 interviews, formed the empirical foundation for Professor Dreary's groundbreaking conclusion that when people don't want to do something, they often don't do it. We're now approximately 20 minutes into this video, and I realize we haven't actually discussed Santa Claus yet. This is intentional. The boring video format requires extensive context building before arriving at the purported topic, much like how a person might spend an hour looking for their keys only to discover they were holding them the entire time. Person number 6 was Reginald Tepidwater, a manufacturer of lukewarm beverages whose business model centered on the radical idea that some people preferred their drinks to be neither hot nor cold, but somewhere in between. His signature product, Adequately Warm Tea, achieved modest success among customers who specifically wanted their beverages to be underwhelming. Reginald's connection to our narrative stems from his annual Christmas party, which was held every December 23rd in the back room of his beverage shop. The party, attended by an average of 3 people per year, accounting for partial attendance, traditionally featured someone dressed as Santa, distributing gifts that Reginald described as acceptably disappointing. In 1844, Reginald's usual Santa, his brother-in-law Mortimer, announced that he would no longer be participating in the Christmas celebration due to what he called a general lack of enthusiasm for holiday-related activities. This created what Reginald's personal journal described as a mild inconvenience requiring resolution. The search for a replacement Santa proved surprisingly difficult. Reginald's first choice, the local postmaster, declined, stating that he was already burdened with delivering things to people and didn't want to compound this burden with additional delivery-based activities. The second choice, a baker named Flanders McBiscuit, explained that his professional relationship with food made him uncomfortable with the idea of consuming cookies left by children, as he was acutely aware of their probable mediocrity. Person number 7 was Prudence Lackwit, a professional conversation ender whose specialty lay in making statements so perfectly mundane that they effectively terminated any ongoing discussion. Her services were popular among people who found themselves trapped in conversations they wanted to escape, but lacked the social skills to end naturally. Prudence's technique involved interjecting comments such as, "That reminds me of a thing that happened once," without ever elaborating on what the thing was, or, "I suppose that's one way to look at it," in response to any statement regardless of its content. Her success rate for ending conversations was an impressive 94%, with the remaining 6% consisting of interactions with people who were professionally obligated to continue talking despite her best efforts. Her relevance to our Santa story is that she attended Reginald's Christmas party in 1844, and upon hearing about the Santa shortage, made the observation that someone should probably do something about that, or not. This statement, which effectively ended all discussion of potential solutions, contributed to the problem's persistence into 1845. Now, if you've made it this far, you clearly need a hobby. Consider subscribing. Person number 8 was Dr. Melvin Prosaic, a medical professional who specialized in treating conditions that were neither serious nor interesting. His practice, known as the Clinic for Mild Complaints, served patients with ailments such as slightly scratchy throat, minor toe discomfort, and generalized feelings of adequate health with room for improvement. Dr. Prosaic's medical philosophy centered on the principle that most problems would resolve themselves given sufficient time and minimal intervention. His treatment protocols typically involve prescribing moderate rest and appropriate hydration, recommendations so universally applicable that they achieved a success rate of approximately 70%, which he considered adequately satisfactory. His connection to our Santa situation began when he was consulted by several residents who experienced what they described as Christmas-related anxiety when asked to portray Santa Claus. Dr. Prosaic diagnosed these cases as seasonal costume reluctance disorder, a condition he invented and which was never recognized by any medical authority. The symptoms of seasonal costume reluctance disorder, according to Dr. Prosaic's clinical notes, included mild discomfort when contemplating wearing red clothing, marginal anxiety regarding fake beard attachment, and general reluctance to engage in ho-ho-ho vocalizations. His recommended treatment was avoiding costume-wearing activities until symptoms subside, which effectively meant never being Santa. Person number 9 was Tabitha Ordinarison, a professional normalcy consultant whose business involved helping people achieve and maintain appropriate levels of social conformity. Her services were popular among individuals who worried they might be too interesting or too boring and needed professional guidance to achieve optimal mediocrity. Tabitha's consultation process involved a comprehensive interestingness assessment that measured clients on various scales, including conversational memorability, unusual hobby engagement, and likelihood of being mentioned in someone else's anecdotes. Based on these assessments, she provided personalized recommendations for becoming more or less remarkable as needed. Most of her clients fell into the excessively ordinary category, requiring interventions to make them slightly more notable without crossing the threshold into actual interestingness. These interventions typically involved suggestions such as occasionally wear slightly different colored socks or express mild preferences about weather patterns. Tabitha's role in the Santa crisis emerged when she was consulted by 3 different residents who were concerned that portraying Santa might make them too memorable within the community. Her professional assessment concluded that Santa portrayal carries significant social visibility risks and recommended alternative holiday participation strategies that maintain appropriate anonymity. These alternative strategies included standing near Christmas decorations without interacting with them, and making generic positive comments about holiday weather. Activities that allowed for festive participation without the burden of being noticed or remembered. Person number 10 was Barnaby Sufficient, a quality control inspector whose job involved determining whether various products met the minimum standards for being considered adequate for their intended purpose. His expertise lay in identifying the precise point at which something transitioned from completely unacceptable to barely acceptable. Barnaby's inspection methodology was remarkably thorough, involving 17-point checklists that measured everything from structural integrity, appropriate for basic function, to color consistency within acceptable deviation parameters. His reports were legendary within quality control circles for their comprehensive documentation of mediocrity. His contribution to our story occurred when he was asked to evaluate a Santa costume that had been purchased for the community Christmas celebration. Barnaby's 47-page inspection report concluded that the costume met minimum standards for recognizable Santa-like appearance, but failed to achieve enthusiasm-inducing visual appeal. The report's detailed findings included observations such as beard attachment mechanism, functions adequately but lacks inspirational qualities, and red fabric coloration falls within acceptable Christmas color parameters while maintaining appropriately subdued festive energy. These findings were subsequently used by potential Santa candidates as justification for declining the role. Person number 11 was Millicent Dullard, a professional boredom consultant whose expertise lay in helping organizations achieve optimal levels of tedium for various applications. Her services were particularly popular among institutions that needed to discourage excessive public interest in their activities. Millicent's techniques for inducing controlled boredom included strategic information oversharing, deliberate pacing manipulation, and purposeful tangent introduction. She had developed these methods through years of research into what she called the science of sustained disinterest. Her involvement in the Santa situation began when the community leaders consulted her about how to make the Christmas celebration less exciting, in hopes that this would reduce the pressure on potential Santa candidates. Millicent's recommendations included extending the gift-giving portion of the celebration to include detailed explanations of each gift selection process and incorporating educational components about the historical development of Christmas traditions. These modifications were implemented in the 1844 celebration, resulting in what attendees described as thoroughly appropriate holiday experience with optimal boredom levels. However, the changes also made the Santa role even less appealing, as it now required not only costume wearing, but also educational ho-ho-ho delivery and historically accurate gift presentation commentary. Person number 12 was Ezekiel Monotone, a professional speech coach who specialized in helping people develop what he called optimally unremarkable communication patterns. His techniques focused on eliminating any trace of excitement, emotion, or memorability from spoken communication. Ezekiel's training methods involved extensive practice in neutral vowel pronunciation, consistently moderate volume control, and topic-independent conversational pacing. Graduates of his program were guaranteed to achieve complete auditory forgettability within 6 months of consistent application. His relevance to our Santa story stems from his involvement in training potential Santa candidates in appropriate holiday character vocalization. This training, which cost $5 per session, covered techniques for delivering ho-ho-ho in ways that were recognizably Santa-like without being excessively memorable or emotionally engaging. However, the training proved counterproductive, as participants reported that learning to say ho-ho-ho in a deliberately monotone manner made them feel increasingly disconnected from the Christmas spirit and professionally obligated to be boring during what should be a joyful activity. Person number 13 was Constance Midling, a professional enthusiasm regulator whose business involved helping people achieve appropriate levels of excitement about various activities and events. Her services were popular among individuals who worried about being either too excited or not excited enough about things that required some level of enthusiasm. Constance's regulatory techniques involved calibrated excitement exercises that helped clients develop what she called socially appropriate response patterns to various situations. These exercises included practicing mild positive reactions to good news, moderate disappointment responses to bad news, and neutral acknowledgement behaviors for neutral information. Her connection to the Santa crisis occurred when she was consulted by several residents who felt that they lacked sufficient Christmas enthusiasm to portray Santa convincingly. Constance's professional assessment concluded that their holiday enthusiasm levels fell within normal parameters for adults in small towns, but were insufficient for character portrayal activities requiring sustained festive energy. Her recommended treatment involved graduated Christmas exposure therapy, which included activities such as looking at Christmas decorations for progressively longer periods and practicing smiling while thinking about holiday traditions. However, most participants found the exercises somehow made Christmas seem like work, which further reduced their willingness to be Santa. We're now approximately 40 minutes into this video, and I can see from the analytics that we've lost 73% of our initial viewers. This is actually better than expected for a deliberately boring video about Christmas. The remaining 27% of you are either genuinely fascinated by the minutiae of 19th century holiday costume reluctance, or you've fallen asleep with the video still playing. If you're one of the 7 people still watching, comment Emperor Blandicus below. Person number 14 was Mortimer Tedious, a professional waiting specialist whose job involved standing in designated areas for predetermined amounts of time while maintaining what his supervisors described as appropriate waiting posture and facial expression. Mortimer's waiting assignments included lobby presence maintenance at the town hall, queue position holding for various administrative processes, and general standing availability for situations that might require someone to be present without actively participating in any activities. His expertise in professional waiting made him a natural candidate for Santa duty, as the role often involved sitting in one location for extended periods while children approached for brief interactions. However, when approached about the position, Mortimer explained that his professional waiting obligations already consumed his available waiting time, leaving him unable to commit to additional waiting-based activities. This response highlighted one of the central problems underlying the Santa shortage. Many of the residents best suited for the role were already employed in activities that utilized the same skill sets that made them qualified Santa candidates. Person number 15 was Beatrice Vapid, a professional small-talk generator, whose specialty lay in producing appropriate conversational content for social situations that required interaction but not genuine communication. Her services were popular at community gatherings, where people needed to appear engaged without risking actual interesting conversations. Beatrice's small-talk repertoire included observations about weather patterns that everyone had already noticed, comments about seasonal activities that required no response, and questions that seemed personal but actually revealed nothing meaningful about either participant in the conversation. Her potential relevance to the Santa role was recognized when someone suggested that her conversational skills would be perfect for interacting with children during gift distribution. However, when consulted about the possibility, Beatrice explained that her professional small talk was calibrated for adult social situations, and that adapting her techniques for children would require extensive conversation-style recalibration that she wasn't prepared to undertake. Person number 16 was Hubert Lackluster, a professional disappointment manager whose business involved helping people achieve appropriate expectations for events and activities that were likely to be less exciting than anticipated. His services were particularly popular for holiday celebrations, family gatherings, and community events. Hubert's disappointment management techniques included expectation calibration consultations that helped clients develop realistic hopes for upcoming events, preview disappointment experiences that prepared people for likely letdowns, and post-event satisfaction optimization that helped people find positive aspects in experiences that had been adequately disappointing. His involvement with the Santa situation occurred when he was hired to help manage community expectations for the 1845 Christmas celebration. His professional assessment concluded that Santa-related disappointment risk could be minimized by eliminating Santa-related expectations, leading to his recommendation that the community consider Santa-free Christmas celebration alternatives. These alternatives included gift distribution by anonymous volunteers and holiday celebration with decorative elements but without character-based entertainment. While these options would have solved the Santa shortage problem, they were rejected by community leaders who felt that Christmas without Santa would be too obviously disappointing, rather than appropriately disappointing. Person number 17 was Gertrude Final, a professional conclusion specialist whose expertise lay in determining when various activities, events, and processes had reached their natural ending points. Her services were valuable for organizations that struggled with knowing when to stop doing things that probably should have ended earlier. Gertrude's conclusion identification methods involved completion indicator analysis, natural stopping point recognition, and appropriate ending timing consultation. Her success rate for accurately identifying optimal conclusion moments was an impressive 89%, making her one of the most sought-after ending professionals in the region. Her role in our Santa story was to evaluate whether the search for a Santa candidate had reached its natural conclusion point. Her professional assessment, delivered in a 12-page report titled Santa Search Conclusion Indicators, an analysis of community character portrayal recruitment completion signals, concluded that continued Santa-seeking activities have exceeded optimal duration parameters and should be terminated in favor of alternative celebration strategies. However, this recommendation was delivered 3 days after the community had already given up looking for a Santa candidate, making her conclusion technically accurate but practically irrelevant. Having now introduced all 17 people whose lives intersected with the Santa crisis of 1845, we can begin to examine the actual events that led to what historians have never called the Great Holiday Character Shortage. Dusty, but first, we need to understand the broader cultural context of Christmas celebration in rural America during the 1840s, which requires examining the evolution of holiday traditions from their European origins through their adaptation to American small-town life. This examination will require approximately 30 more minutes of detailed historical analysis, during which we'll explore topics such as the sociological implications of seasonal costume wearing and economic factors affecting community holiday participation rates. These topics are fascinating to exactly no one, which makes them perfect for our purposes. But before we continue, let me remind you that somewhere in this video, there's a small Christmas detail that you probably won't notice. We're not there yet. In fact, we're nowhere near there yet, but it's coming eventually, like everything else in this deliberately paced narrative. Now that we've established the biographical foundations of our story through the completely unnecessary introduction of 17 irrelevant people, we can begin examining the actual cultural and economic factors that contributed to the Santa shortage of 1845. But first, we need to understand what Santa Claus actually was in 1845, which requires a detailed examination of the evolution of Christmas traditions from their ancient origins to their 19th century American manifestations. The figure we now recognize as Santa Claus developed through a complex process of cultural synthesis that began with St. Nicholas of Myra, a 4th century bishop whose primary historical significance lay in his reputation for anonymous gift-giving. However, St. Nicholas's transformation into the modern Santa Claus involved contributions from Dutch folk traditions, Germanic winter celebrations, British Christmas customs, and American commercial influences. But none of that is particularly relevant to why nobody wanted to be Santa in Mediocrity Falls in 1845, which is why we're going to spend the next several thousand words examining it in exhaustive detail. St. Nicholas of Myra was born sometime around 270 CE in the ancient city of Myra, located in what is now Turkey. His early life was marked by what his biographers describe as appropriate religious devotion and satisfactory charitable activities. The most famous legend associated with St. Nicholas involves his secret provision of dowries for 3 poor sisters, which he accomplished by dropping bags of gold through their window on 3 separate occasions. This legend, while inspiring, raises several practical questions that medieval chroniclers failed to address adequately. For instance, what was the exact weight of the gold bags? Were they leather bags or cloth bags? How did St. Nicholas determine the appropriate dowry amount for each sister? Did he conduct market research on dowry rates? These questions, while obviously important for a complete understanding of the Santa Claus origin story, have never been satisfactorily answered. The transformation of St. Nicholas from a 4th century bishop into a holiday gift-bringer required approximately 1,500 years of gradual cultural evolution, during which various European communities added their own interpretations to the basic story. The Dutch version, known as Sinterklaas, portrayed St. Nicholas as a bishop who arrived by ship from Spain, for reasons that are historically unclear but culturally persistent, to distribute gifts to children who had been adequately good during the previous year. The Sinterklaas tradition included several elements that would eventually become associated with the American Santa Claus, including the red bishop's robes, which would evolve into Santa's red suit. The practice of entering homes at night to leave gifts, which would become chimney-based home invasion, and the maintenance of lists tracking children's behavioral patterns, which would develop into the modern surveillance-based gift distribution system. However, the Dutch Sinterklaas differed from the later American Santa in several significant ways. Sinterklaas was typically portrayed as a tall, thin, dignified religious figure, rather than the jolly, rotund character that would emerge in 19th century America. He was accompanied by assistants called Zwarte Piet, Black Pete, who helped with gift distribution and, according to some versions of the tradition, punished naughty children by putting them in bags and taking them back to Spain. This punitive aspect of the Sinterklaas tradition was largely eliminated in the American version of Santa Claus, which focused almost exclusively on gift-giving and positive reinforcement. The removal of punishment from the Santa Claus mythology created what cultural historians have described as a purely benevolent holiday authority figure, though this benevolence was somewhat undermined by the persistent surveillance implications of the "he knows when you've been sleeping, he knows when you're awake" lyrical tradition. The Germanic contributions to Santa Claus mythology came primarily through the figure of Weihnachtsmann, a Christmas gift-bringer who combined Christian traditions with pre-Christian winter solstice celebrations. The Germanic tradition emphasized the connection between Christmas and winter weather, establishing the association between Santa and snow that would become central to American Christmas imagery, despite the fact that many Americans lived in climates where snow was either rare or non-existent during December. The British contributions to Santa Claus development were more complex and involved several different traditional figures, including Father Christmas, who was more associated with adult Christmas celebrations and general holiday merriment than with children's gifts. Father Christmas was typically portrayed as a bearded figure in green or red robes who embodied the spirit of Christmas feasting and celebration. The synthesis of these various European traditions into the American Santa Claus occurred primarily during the early 19th century, with significant contributions from writers such as Washington Irving and Clement Clarke Moore. Irving's 1809, A History of New York, included references to St. Nicholas that helped establish the saint's association with New York Dutch culture, while Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, commonly known as The Night Before Christmas, provided many of the specific details that would define the American Santa Claus. Moore's poem established Santa as a jolly old elf who traveled by sleigh pulled by reindeer, entered homes through chimneys, and was characterized by his round belly and jolly demeanor. The poem also specified that Santa's visit occurred on Christmas Eve, rather than the December 6th St. Nicholas Day, traditionally celebrated in European cultures. However, none of this extensive cultural and literary development addresses why the residents of Mediocrity Falls were reluctant to portray Santa Claus in 1845. To understand that, we need to examine the specific challenges associated with Santa portrayal in small-town American communities during the 1840s. The primary challenge was costume-related. Creating a convincing Santa costume in 1845 required resources and skills that were not readily available in rural communities. The red suit, which had become standardized through Moore's poem and various illustrations, needed to be sewn from appropriate fabric, which had to be obtained from regional suppliers who might not have adequate quantities of red wool or cloth in stock. The beard presented even greater difficulties. A convincing Santa beard required either natural white facial hair, which most potential candidates lacked, or artificial beard construction using materials such as cotton, wool, or horsehair. The attachment of artificial beards required techniques that were not commonly known outside of theatrical communities, and even when properly attached, artificial beards were prone to shifting, falling off, or looking obviously artificial. The belly expansion required for proper Santa proportions presented additional challenges. Creating the appearance of appropriate Santa rotundity typically involved stuffing clothing with various materials such as pillows, straw, or cloth, but achieving a convincing round belly shape required considerable skill in padding distribution and attachment. Poorly executed belly padding could shift during movement, creating an obviously artificial appearance that undermined the Santa illusion. Beyond the costume challenges, Santa portrayal required performance skills that many community members found uncomfortable. The ho-ho-ho vocalization, while seemingly simple, actually required considerable practice to deliver convincingly. Most amateur Santa candidates discovered that their natural attempts at ho-ho-ho sounded either forced and artificial or insufficiently jolly. The gift distribution aspect of Santa performance created additional pressure. Santa was expected to remember children's names, engage in brief conversations about their behavior during the past year, and make appropriate gift selections or presentations. This required social skills and memory capabilities that not all community members possessed, particularly when combined with the physical discomfort of wearing a costume and the performance pressure of maintaining character. Furthermore, the Santa role carried social expectations that extended beyond the immediate performance. Santa was expected to embody Christmas spirit not just during the gift-giving event, but throughout the holiday season. Community members who agreed to be Santa often found themselves subjected to increased scrutiny regarding their holiday enthusiasm, charitable activities, and general moral behavior. These practical and social challenges were compounded by what we might now recognize as performance anxiety. Many potential Santa candidates reported feeling that they would not be able to live up to community expectations for Santa-like behavior and worried about disappointing children if their performance was inadequate. Dr. Prosaic's medical records from 1844-1845 document 17 cases of what he diagnosed as Santa performance anxiety disorder, characterized by symptoms such as increased perspiration when discussing Christmas topics, involuntary flinching when red fabric was mentioned, and compulsive beard touching when in the presence of children. The economic factors contributing to Santa reluctance were equally significant but considerably more boring. The cost of creating or renting a Santa costume represented a substantial financial investment for families in Mediocrity Falls, where the average annual income was approximately $347, according to tax records that nobody has ever bothered to verify. A complete Santa costume, including suit, beard, boots, and padding materials, cost between $12 and $18 to assemble, representing roughly 3 to 5% of a typical family's annual income. This expense was particularly burdensome because Santa costumes had extremely limited reusability. They could only be worn for Christmas-related activities, and even then, only by individuals who matched the general size and build of the original costume owner. The rental market for Santa costumes was virtually non-existent in rural areas during the 1840s. The nearest costume rental establishment was located in Pittsburgh, approximately 127 miles from Mediocrity Falls, making costume rental logistically impossible for most residents. Even if transportation could be arranged, the round-trip journey would have taken 4 to 6 days by wagon, making it impractical for a single-day Christmas celebration. Some entrepreneurial community members attempted to create costume-sharing arrangements, but these proved problematic due to hygiene concerns and size variations among potential Santa candidates. The shared costume owned by the Mediocrity Falls Community Improvement Society, an organization with 3 members and no documented improvements to its credit, was described in contemporary accounts as adequately Santa-like, but concerning from a cleanliness perspective. The hygiene issue was not trivial in an era before modern cleaning techniques and synthetic fabrics. Santa costumes made from wool or other natural fibers absorbed odors and bodily fluids during wear, and effective cleaning required techniques that could damage or alter the costume's appearance. The shared costume's condition deteriorated significantly after each use, leading to disputes among community members about cleaning responsibilities and replacement costs. Size variations among potential Santa candidates created additional complications for costume sharing. Mediocrity Falls' adult male population ranged in height from diminutive Dan, 4'11", to towering Tom, 6'7", with corresponding variations in weight and general body proportions. A costume sized for one individual rarely fit others adequately, leading to Santa appearances that ranged from comically oversized to obviously inadequate coverage. The attempt to create an adjustable Santa costume using a system of buttons, ties, and removable padding proved unsuccessful when the adjustment mechanisms became visible during public appearances, undermining the Santa illusion. Children began referring to the community Santa as button Santa or tie Santa, which deflated whatever Christmas magic the costume was intended to create. Weather-related factors also contributed to Santa reluctance in 1845. December 1845 was unusually warm in western Pennsylvania, with temperatures reaching 67 degrees on December 23rd. The Santa costume, designed for cold weather both practically and symbolically, became uncomfortably hot when worn indoors or during outdoor celebrations in warm weather. Contemporary accounts describe Santa candidates sweating profusely while wearing the heavy woolen costume, leading to what witnesses described as visibly uncomfortable Santa performances and Christmas celebrations with concerning amounts of Santa perspiration. The image of a sweating, uncomfortable Santa proved antithetical to the jolly, comfortable demeanor that children expected from their Christmas gift-bringer. The warm weather also eliminated the snow that was considered essential for proper Christmas atmosphere in 1845. Without snow, Santa's association with winter weather seemed inappropriate and out of place. Several potential Santa candidates cited the lack of snow as a reason for declining the role, arguing that portraying a winter-themed character during warm weather would confuse children and undermine Christmas traditions. Let me pause here to note that if you've made it this far into this video, you're either genuinely interested in the meteorological factors affecting 19th century holiday costume performance, or you have a remarkable tolerance for tedium. Either way, you represent less than 15% of our original viewership, making you statistically unusual in your commitment to consuming boring content. The social pressure associated with Santa performance created additional barriers to participation. Santa was expected to be knowledgeable about every child in the community, including their names, ages, behavioral patterns, gift preferences, and family circumstances. This expectation required extensive preparation and research that most volunteers were unwilling to undertake. The information gathering process for effective Santa performance involved consulting with parents, teachers, local merchants, and other community members to compile comprehensive profiles of each child's Christmas-related characteristics. This process was time-consuming and often revealed information that potential Santas preferred not to know, such as family financial difficulties that affected gift-giving capacity or behavioral problems that created uncertainty about appropriate Santa responses. The knowledge management challenges were compounded by the expectation that Santa should remember details from previous Christmas interactions. Children often referred to gifts received in previous years or promises made by previous Santas, creating continuity requirements that new Santa candidates found overwhelming. The community had attempted to address this problem by creating written records of Santa-child interactions, but the record-keeping system proved inadequate. The Santa Memory Book, maintained by the Mediocrity Falls Christmas Celebration Committee, an organization consisting of Mrs. Henderson and her daughter Margaret, contained entries such as "Little Jimmy wants something good" and "Sally's family has situation," which provided insufficient detail for meaningful Santa preparation. The emotional labor required for Santa performance was another significant deterrent. Santa was expected to maintain consistent jolly enthusiasm regardless of children's behavior, family circumstances, or personal challenges. This requirement for emotional regulation proved taxing for community members who were dealing with their own difficulties or who naturally had what Dr. Prosaic classified as limited enthusiasm reserves. Several potential Santa candidates reported that practicing jolly behavior made them feel emotionally exhausted and artificially cheerful in ways that interfered with their normal emotional functioning. The disconnect between required Santa emotions and authentic personal feelings created what modern psychology might recognize as emotional dissonance, though in 1845 it was simply described as feeling funny about being fake happy. The children's expectations for Santa performance had also escalated beyond what many adults felt capable of meeting. Influenced by the increasingly detailed descriptions of Santa in literature and illustrations, children expected their local Santa to match the magical, omniscient figure described in stories and poems. These expectations included supernatural knowledge of children's private thoughts and behaviors, magical gift production capabilities, and the ability to travel impossibly long distances in impossibly short time periods. Local Santa candidates, being normal human beings with normal human limitations, found these expectations impossible to fulfill convincingly. The attempts to explain Santa's limitations to children proved counterproductive, as these explanations undermined the magical aspects of the Santa experience that made the performance worthwhile. Community members found themselves trapped between unrealistic expectations and the inability to meet those expectations without destroying the illusion they were trying to create. The religious complications surrounding Santa performance added another layer of difficulty. Some community members objected to Santa portrayal on theological grounds, arguing that the figure represented a secularization of Christian holiday traditions that was inappropriate for a religious celebration. These religious objections were not universal or consistently applied, but they created community tension that made Santa candidacy socially complicated. Potential Santas worried about offending religious community members, while religious community members worried about endorsing what they perceived as non-Christian elements of Christmas celebration. The theological debates surrounding Santa Claus in Mediocrity Falls were extensively documented in the minutes of the Community Standards Discussion Group, an organization that met monthly to discuss topics that bothered people but weren't important enough to require actual action. The Santa-related discussions consumed 17 meetings between October 1844 and February 1845, ultimately concluding that Santa Claus is probably fine, but maybe not ideal. This conclusion satisfied no one and resolved nothing, but it represented the community's best effort at collective decision-making regarding controversial holiday figures. The minutes note that the final vote was 4 in favor of Santa, 3 opposed, and 2 abstentions, with 1 member voting present and another voting maybe later. The Community Standards Discussion Group's indecision contributed to the uncertainty surrounding Santa portrayal, as potential candidates were unsure whether their participation would be welcomed or criticized by different segments of the community. This social uncertainty was particularly problematic in a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and social approval was important for day-to-day community functioning. We're now approaching the 1-hour mark of this video, and I want to acknowledge that we still haven't reached the actual events of 1845. This is intentional. The boring video format requires extensive context development before arriving at the purported main content, much like how a government meeting might spend 3 hours discussing the agenda before beginning the actual agenda items. The bureaucratic aspects of Santa selection also contributed to the shortage. The Mediocrity Falls Christmas Celebration Committee had developed a formal application process for Santa candidates that required completion of a 6-page questionnaire, 3 character references, and a brief performance audition. The questionnaire, titled Application for Community Santa Representation Position, included questions such as, rate your current level of Christmas enthusiasm on a scale of 1 to 10, and describe your experience with child-related performance activities. Most of the questions required essay-style responses that were evaluated by committee members using criteria that were never clearly explained to applicants. The character reference requirement proved particularly problematic because many community members were reluctant to provide formal endorsements for activities they considered either religiously questionable or socially awkward. Potential Santa candidates often struggled to find 3 people willing to vouch for their Santa-related capabilities in writing. The performance audition component required candidates to demonstrate their ho-ho-ho delivery, gift-giving demeanor, and ability to interact appropriately with children, represented by committee members pretending to be children. These auditions were held in the community center on Tuesday evenings and were open to public observation, creating additional performance pressure for already nervous candidates. The audition process was documented in the committee's records, which note that most candidates were adequate but lacking in genuine Santa enthusiasm, or technically competent but insufficiently jolly. Only 1 candidate was rated as convincingly Santa-like, but he withdrew his application after learning that the position required attendance at multiple community events throughout December. The time commitment associated with Santa duty was indeed substantial. Beyond the main Christmas celebration, Santa was expected to appear at the community tree lighting, the children's Christmas pageant, the Merchants Association holiday gathering, and various private family celebrations. This schedule required approximately 15 hours of Santa performance over a 2-week period, plus preparation time for costume maintenance and child-specific research. Most community members found this time commitment incompatible with their existing work and family obligations. The December period was particularly busy for farmers completing end-of-year activities, merchants managing increased holiday sales, and families preparing for their own Christmas celebrations. The compensation for Santa duty was minimal, typically consisting of a shared Christmas dinner and a small monetary gift from the community treasury. This compensation was considered adequate for a volunteer activity, but insufficient for what had become a demanding part-time job with significant preparation requirements and social expectations. Several community members suggested hiring a professional Santa from a larger city, but investigation revealed that professional Santa services were essentially non-existent in 1845. The few individuals who performed as Santa in urban areas were typically theater performers who already had other Christmas commitments or were unavailable for travel to small rural communities. The transportation and accommodation costs for bringing an outside Santa to Mediocrity Falls would have exceeded the community's entertainment budget by approximately 400%, making this solution financially impossible even if qualified candidates could have been located. The community also considered alternative approaches to Christmas celebration that would eliminate the need for Santa entirely. These alternatives included gift exchange without character performance, Christmas celebration focused on religious themes, and postponement of Christmas until suitable Santa candidate becomes available. None of these alternatives gained sufficient community support to be implemented. The gift exchange without Santa was criticized as insufficiently festive, the religious-focused celebration was deemed too serious for children, and the Christmas postponement was rejected as logistically impossible and potentially confusing. The postponement idea deserves additional examination because it reveals the community's commitment to proper Christmas celebration despite the practical difficulties. The proposal suggested by Prudence Lackwit during a community meeting involved delaying Christmas celebration until January or February, when a suitable Santa candidate might be found or developed. Supporters of the postponement argued that Christmas could be celebrated at any time and that ensuring proper Santa representation was more important than celebrating on the traditional date. Opponents argued that Christmas postponement would confuse children and disrupt community traditions that were already well established. The debate over Christmas postponement consumed 3 community meetings and resulted in what meeting minutes describe as considerable discussion without resolution. The final vote was 12 against postponement, 8 in favor and 7 abstentions, with several community members leaving before the vote was taken. This brings us to November 1845, when the community faced the reality that Christmas was approaching and no Santa candidate had been secured despite months of recruitment efforts. The Christmas Celebration Committee had exhausted their list of potential candidates and had begun considering increasingly desperate alternatives, but we're not quite ready to discuss the November 1845 crisis yet. First, we need to examine the specific recruitment techniques that had been attempted and why each had failed to produce a suitable Santa candidate. This examination will require approximately 20 more minutes of detailed analysis of community dynamics and individual psychology as applied to holiday character portrayal. We'll return to this after we explore the fascinating topic of Christmas recruitment methodology in small-town America, a case study in community character development. This topic is as boring as it sounds, which makes it perfect for our continuing journey into the depths of holiday-related tedium. And so we arrive at November 15th, 1845, the day that would change everything, or perhaps change nothing. The suspense is, I assure you, overwhelming in its complete lack of urgency. Mrs. Henderson, chairwoman of the Mediocrity Falls Christmas Celebration Committee, Membership 2, sat at her kitchen table reviewing the official Santa candidate status report for what she noted in her diary as the 17th time this week. The report, written in her own handwriting, read simply, "No one wants to do it." This moment, this precise moment of bureaucratic defeat in the face of holiday logistics, represents what historians have never called the turning point of the Santa crisis. The dramatic tension was palpable, if by palpable we mean completely absent but theoretically present in the minds of the two people who cared about this situation. But before we reveal what happened next, spoiler alert, something mundane occurred, We need to examine the psychological factors that led to this moment of community Christmas crisis. The suspense of whether Mediocrity Falls would have a Santa for Christmas 1845 was building to levels that can only be described as barely noticeable. The recruitment techniques employed by the Christmas Celebration Committee had followed what Mrs. Henderson described as a systematic approach to volunteer acquisition. This systematic approach consisted of asking people directly if they wanted to be Santa, and when they said no, asking them again slightly louder. The direct approach had been attempted with 37 adult male community members, all of whom had declined for reasons ranging from absolutely not to I would rather be attacked by bears. The committee had carefully documented these refusals in their Santa rejection registry, which made for fascinating reading. Sample entries from the Santa rejection registry include November 3rd, approached Barnaby Milquetoast regarding Santa position. Response, no thank you and please don't ask again. Note, he seemed quite firm about this. November 4th, reapproached Barnaby Milquetoast regarding Santa position. Response, I said no yesterday, and I mean no today. Note, persistence may not be effective strategy with Mr. Milquetoast. November 5th, final approach to Barnaby Milquetoast regarding Santa position. Response, if you ask me again, I will move to Ohio. Note, Mr. Milquetoast appears genuinely committed to avoiding Santa duty. The registry contained similar entries for all 37 candidates, revealing a pattern of community-wide resistance to Santa portrayal that the committee found both disappointing and inexplicable. Mrs. Henderson's analysis of the rejection patterns led to her conclusion that people nowadays seem unwilling to participate in activities that require effort. The committee's secondary recruitment strategy involved what they called indirect Santa suggestion, which consisted of mentioning during casual conversations how nice it would be if someone volunteered to be Santa. This approach proved even less effective than direct asking, as it typically resulted in awkward silences, followed by rapid changes of subject. The indirect suggestion technique was documented in Mrs. Henderson's personal notes, which record conversations such as, mentioned to Mrs. Pemberton while purchasing eggs that Santa season was approaching, and we still needed someone to fill the role. Mrs. Pemberton suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere and left without completing her egg purchase. Note, this approach may be too subtle. Commented to Mr. Wilkins during church that children would be disappointed if there was no Santa this year. Mr. Wilkins responded by discussing the weather at unusual length. Note, weather may be a more popular topic than Santa recruitment. The committee's third strategy, Santa duty guilt application, involved explaining to potential candidates how disappointed children would be if there was no Santa for Christmas. This approach backfired when several community members pointed out that disappointing children might be character building and that Christmas celebrations had existed for centuries without requiring local Santa representation. The guilt application technique also raised philosophical questions about community responsibility that the committee was unprepared to address. When asked why Santa duty was a community obligation rather than a personal choice, Mrs. Henderson could only respond that someone has to do it, which several potential candidates found insufficiently compelling. The committee's fourth and final recruitment strategy was Santa position enhancement, which involved adding benefits and reducing requirements in hopes of making the role more attractive. These enhancements included reducing required appearances from 7 events to 4 events, providing a free Christmas dinner for the Santa and his family, offering assistance with costume preparation and maintenance, guaranteeing that Santa would not be expected to remember all children's names, promising that ho-ho-ho delivery could be practiced privately before public appearances. These enhancements failed to generate interest among potential candidates, several of whom pointed out that the reduced requirements made the position seem less important rather than more attractive. The offer of assistance with costume preparation was viewed with suspicion, as no one was certain who would be providing this assistance or whether they were qualified to do so. The free Christmas dinner was dismissed by most candidates as inadequate compensation for the time and effort required, while the name-remembering guarantee was seen as an admission that the Santa role was too difficult for normal people to perform adequately. By November 15th, the committee had exhausted all conventional recruitment approaches and was facing what Mrs. Henderson's diary describes as a Christmas emergency of moderate significance. The dramatic tension was reaching what can only be described as barely detectable levels, and then something happened. Something that would change the trajectory of Mediocrity Falls' Christmas celebration forever, or at least until the next year. But before we reveal this momentous development, we need to examine the broader implications of Santa shortages in 19th century American communities. Because nothing builds suspense quite like extended historical analysis of holiday labor market dynamics. The Santa shortage phenomenon was not unique to Mediocrity Falls. Similar situations had been reported in communities across rural America, suggesting that the reluctance to portray Santa Claus was a widespread cultural trend rather than a localized problem. The National Association of Community Holiday Coordinators, an organization with 6 members and no official recognition, had documented Santa shortages in over 40 communities between 1843 and 1845. Their report, The Crisis in Christmas Character Availability, identified several contributing factors, including increased expectations for holiday performance quality and general decline in community volunteerism for costume-based activities. The report's findings suggested that American communities were experiencing what sociologists would later term holiday performance inflation, a phenomenon where expectations for Christmas celebrations gradually increased beyond the capabilities of volunteer community members to fulfill. This holiday performance inflation was attributed to the influence of urban Christmas celebrations, which featured professional entertainers and elaborate productions that set standards rural communities could not realistically match. Children who had heard descriptions of city Christmas celebrations expected their local celebrations to include similar levels of spectacle and professionalism. The urban-rural Christmas expectation gap created pressure on small-town Santa candidates to compete with professional entertainers using only amateur skills and limited resources. This pressure contributed to performance anxiety and recruitment difficulties in communities that had previously been able to find Santa volunteers easily. The National Association's report also noted that Santa shortages were more common in communities where Christmas had only recently become a major celebration. In areas where Christmas traditions were well established, community members had developed institutional knowledge and social expectations that supported Santa recruitment. In newer communities or areas where Christmas celebration was evolving rapidly, the social infrastructure for holiday volunteer recruitment was often inadequate. Mediocrity Falls fell into the latter category, as the community had only begun organizing formal Christmas celebrations in 1841. Prior to that, Christmas had been observed primarily as a religious holiday with minimal community-wide activities. The transition to secular Christmas celebration with Santa-based entertainment had created new organizational challenges that the community was still learning to address. The timing of Mediocrity Falls' Santa crisis coincided with what historians have documented as a period of rapid change in American Christmas traditions. The 1840s were a decade when many Christmas customs were being established or modified, creating uncertainty about appropriate celebration methods and community expectations. This uncertainty was particularly problematic for Santa portrayal because the role required confidence and authority that was difficult to maintain when community members were uncertain about what Santa was supposed to do or how he was supposed to behave. The suspense continues to build as we approach the moment of crisis resolution, or crisis persistence. The outcome remains thrillingly unclear. On November 16, 1845, Mrs. Henderson made a decision that would echo through the ages, if by echo through the ages we mean be completely forgotten within 6 months. She decided to expand the Santa candidate search beyond the adult male population of Mediocrity Falls. This decision represented a radical departure from traditional Santa recruitment practices, which had always assumed that Santa must be portrayed by a local adult male. Mrs. Henderson's willingness to consider alternative approaches demonstrated what her daughter Margaret described as unprecedented flexibility in holiday character management. The first alternative candidate category considered was adult females dressed as male Santa. This approach had theoretical advantages, including a potentially larger candidate pool and the possibility that women might be more willing to engage in child-focused performance activities. However, the cross-gender Santa portrayal raised social and practical complications that the committee was unprepared to address. The social acceptability of women wearing men's clothing, even for holiday entertainment purposes, was questionable in 1845 rural Pennsylvania. The practical challenges of creating convincing masculine Santa appearance for female performers were also significant. The committee consulted with community leaders about the appropriateness of female Santa candidates, receiving responses that ranged from absolutely inappropriate to probably not a good idea to "I have no opinion and prefer not to be involved in this discussion." The lack of clear community guidance on female Santa acceptability led to what Mrs. Henderson's notes describe as considerable uncertainty regarding appropriate candidate expansion parameters. The committee ultimately decided to table the female Santa option pending further community consultation. The second alternative candidate category was adolescent males with adult supervision. This approach would involve recruiting teenage boys to portray Santa while being assisted by adult community members who would handle logistical aspects of the role. The adolescent Santa concept had several potential advantages, including greater availability among the candidate pool and natural enthusiasm for performance activities. However, it also raised questions about the credibility of teenage Santa portrayal and the logistics of adult-adolescent collaboration in public performance situations. The committee identified 3 potential adolescent candidates: Timothy Youngerson, age 16, Frederick Barely Adult, age 17, and William Almost Grown, age 15. All 3 candidates expressed more interest in Santa duty than any adult community member had shown, but their parents had concerns about the appropriateness and safety of adolescent holiday performance responsibilities. The parental concerns were documented in a series of letters to the Christmas Celebration Committee, which reveal the complex considerations involved in adolescent Santa recruitment. Timothy is interested in the Santa position, but we are concerned about whether he has sufficient maturity to represent our community appropriately during Christmas celebrations. Also, he has not yet mastered the art of speaking to children without giggling, which may undermine the Santa experience. Mr. and Mrs. Youngerson. Frederick would be delighted to be Santa, but we worry that his voice has not finished changing, and his ho-ho-ho sometimes sounds more like he, which seems insufficiently Santa-like. The Barely Adult family. William is very enthusiastic about Christmas and would probably make a good Santa, but he is still growing, and we are not sure the costume would fit properly throughout the entire Christmas season. Mrs. Almost Grown. These concerns highlighted the challenges of adolescent Santa recruitment and led to what committee meeting minutes describe as extensive deliberation regarding age-appropriate holiday character portrayal standards. The committee's deliberations were complicated by the absence of any established guidelines for minimum Santa age requirements. The question of whether Santa needed to be portrayed by adults had never been formally addressed because no community had previously faced such a severe shortage of adult Santa candidates. After 3 committee meetings dedicated to the adolescent Santa question, Mrs. Henderson and her daughter Margaret reached what their final report describes as a provisional decision to consider adolescent candidates on a case-by-case basis pending successful completion of Santa readiness evaluation procedures. The Santa readiness evaluation procedures were hastily developed and consisted of tests for appropriate Santa voice quality, sufficient Christmas knowledge, adequate child interaction skills, and believable jolly demeanor maintenance. These procedures were administered to all 3 adolescent candidates during a session held in the community center on November 22nd. The evaluation results were mixed. Timothy Youngerson demonstrated excellent Santa voice quality and adequate Christmas knowledge, but struggled with jolly demeanor maintenance, particularly when asked to remain jolly while discussing hypothetical situations such as what if children ask for gifts their families cannot afford, and how to respond when children report misbehavior by siblings. Frederick Barely Adult showed strong Christmas knowledge and excellent child interaction skills, but his voice quality remained problematic due to ongoing adolescent voice changes. His ho-ho-ho was described in evaluation notes as enthusiastic but inconsistent in pitch, and occasionally breaking into higher registers unexpectedly. William Almost Grown received high marks for jolly demeanor maintenance and child interaction skills, but demonstrated gaps in Christmas knowledge when asked questions about Santa's reindeer names, North Pole workshop operations, and historical gift-giving precedents. None of the three candidates received passing scores in all evaluation categories, leading to what Mrs. Henderson described as continued Santa candidate insufficiency despite expanded recruitment parameters. The evaluation failure led to consideration of the committee's third alternative recruitment category, external Santa importation from neighboring communities. This approach would involve asking nearby towns if they had surplus Santa candidates who might be willing to serve Mediocrity Falls during their own community's Christmas celebrations. Research into neighboring community Santa availability was conducted through a letter-writing campaign coordinated by Margaret Henderson, who sent inquiries to 13 nearby towns asking about Santa candidate sharing possibilities. The responses were universally negative. Sample replies included, "We regret to inform you that our own Santa candidate is barely adequate for our needs and could not take on additional community responsibilities." Blandsburg Christmas Committee. "Our Santa situation is precarious at best, and we cannot spare any candidates for external communities." Dulltown Holiday Coordination Group. "We do not currently have a Santa and are also seeking candidates. If you find extras, please let us know." Mediocrity Mills Entertainment Planning Association. The external Santa importation strategy's failure led to what committee records describe as recognition that the Santa shortage phenomenon was regionally widespread and that cooperative solutions were not feasible given universally inadequate candidate availability. This realization brought the committee to what Mrs. Henderson characterized as the moment of ultimate decision-making regarding Christmas celebration continuation. The suspense was reaching truly moderate levels, and then on November 23, 1845, something remarkable happened, something that would forever change how Christmas was celebrated in Mediocrity Falls, Pennsylvania, something that no one saw coming, probably because no one was paying attention. But before we reveal this shocking development, we need to take a moment to appreciate the mathematical implications of community Christmas organization in pre-industrial American society. Because nothing maintains suspense quite like statistical analysis of holiday logistics. The mathematical challenge of coordinating Christmas celebrations in small communities like Mediocrity Falls involved complex calculations regarding resource allocation, time management, and volunteer coordination. Mrs. Henderson's personal papers include detailed charts tracking various quantitative aspects of Christmas planning. Her Christmas resource requirement analysis calculated that a proper community Christmas celebration required a minimum of 47 volunteer hours, 33 pounds of various foodstuffs, 17 different types of decorative materials, and one convincing Santa Claus. The Santa requirement represented the only non-negotiable element in the equation, making it the critical factor determining celebration feasibility. The calculation of volunteer hour requirements was based on previous year's experiences and included time allocations for decoration installation, 8 hours, food preparation, 12 hours, event coordination, 11 hours, setup and cleanup, 9 hours, and Santa-related activities, 7 hours. The Santa time allocation included costume preparation, child interaction, and gift distribution activities. Mrs. Henderson's resource calculations revealed that Mediocrity Falls Christmas celebration operated on what modern project managers would recognize as extremely tight margins. The loss of any major component, particularly the Santa element, threatened the viability of the entire celebration structure. The mathematical precision of Mrs. Henderson's planning documents stands in stark contrast to the apparent randomness of the community's Santa recruitment failures. This contrast suggests that holiday planning success depends not only on adequate organization, but also on community willingness to participate in organized activities. The quantitative approach to Christmas planning was relatively unusual for small American communities in the 1840s, most of which relied on informal coordination and traditional practices rather than systematic resource analysis. Mrs. Henderson's mathematical methodology may have contributed to the Santa recruitment difficulties by making the volunteer requirements seem more burdensome and official than they actually needed to be. Her analysis also revealed the economic impact of Christmas celebration on the community. The total estimated cost of the 1845 Christmas celebration was $23.47, representing approximately 0.3% of the community's estimated annual economic activity. This percentage was within normal parameters for community cultural activities, but the concentration of expenses in a single event created temporary financial pressure on participating families. The economic analysis included consideration of Santa-related costs, which represented approximately 30% of the total celebration budget. This high percentage was due to costume expenses, compensation for Santa duties, and additional food costs for Santa-related events. The elimination of Santa would have reduced celebration costs significantly, while compromising what Mrs. Henderson considered essential Christmas elements. But we're still building suspense toward the November 23rd revelation, which promises to resolve the Santa crisis in ways that are either completely unexpected or entirely predictable, depending on your tolerance for anticlimactic endings. The suspense reaches its peak as we approach the moment when everything changed, or perhaps when nothing changed, but people thought it might have changed, which is essentially the same thing from a community organizing perspective. Are you ready for the revelation? Of course you're not. No one is ever ready for moderately significant developments in 19th century holiday character recruitment stories. But ready or not, we're about to discover what happened on that fateful November day when Mrs. Henderson made the decision that would determine the fate of Christmas 1845 in Mediocrity Falls, Pennsylvania. The dramatic tension is now at maximum sustainable levels, which is to say, barely perceptible but technically present. And so, with great ceremony and minimal excitement, we arrive at the moment of truth. What happened on November 23, 1845 was this. Mrs. Henderson had soup for lunch. Not great soup, just soup. But more significantly, while eating this unremarkable soup, which was made from turnips and contained what her diary describes as adequate seasoning, Mrs. Henderson made a decision that would forever alter the Christmas celebration landscape of Mediocrity Falls. She decided to be Santa herself. This decision, which took approximately 4 seconds to make and 37 years to document properly, represented what community historians have never called the great gender role reversal of rural Pennsylvania Christmas celebrations. The decision was made, according to Mrs. Henderson's own account, out of sheer frustration with the complete inability of adult males to perform simple holiday tasks. But before we examine the implications of this groundbreaking decision, we need to analyze the soup that catalyzed it. Because in boring videos, every detail matters, especially details that don't matter at all. The soup in question was prepared using turnips grown in Mrs. Henderson's own garden, specifically in the northeast corner, where the soil was described in her gardening journal as adequately nutritious but somewhat disappointing in mineral content. The turnips were harvested on November 18th, after what Mrs. Henderson noted was a growing season of appropriate length but uninspiring weather conditions. The turnip selection process involved choosing vegetables that were sufficiently large for soup purposes, but not so large as to suggest excessive attention to gardening activities. Mrs. Henderson's philosophy regarding vegetable cultivation emphasized adequacy over excellence, which she believed was more appropriate for a woman of her social position in a small rural community. The soup preparation methodology followed what Mrs. Henderson called the standard approach to turnip-based liquid nutrition. This involved peeling the turnips, using a knife that was sharp enough for vegetable preparation, but not sharp enough to suggest professional cooking ambitions, cutting them into pieces of uniform size within reasonable tolerances, and boiling them in water, drawn from the well that had been tested for basic safety but not analyzed for flavor enhancement properties. The seasoning consisted of salt, obtained from the general store and assumed to be adequate for culinary purposes, and what Mrs. Henderson's recipe notes describe as herbs from the garden that seemed appropriate for soup applications. These herbs were later identified as parsley and thyme, both of which had been grown with attention to basic horticultural requirements, but without excessive concern for optimal flavor development. The cooking process required approximately 45 minutes of boiling, during which Mrs. Henderson attended to other household tasks, including review of Christmas celebration documentation and consideration of various community organization challenges. It was during this consideration period that the Santa decision occurred. Mrs. Henderson's account of the decision-making process, recorded in her personal journal 3 days later, provides insight into the thought patterns that led to this revolutionary development. While stirring the soup, which required stirring approximately every 7 minutes to prevent sticking, I reflected on the complete failure of our Santa recruitment efforts and the approaching deadline for Christmas celebration organization. The continued refusal of community men to participate in holiday activities struck me as indicative of a broader pattern of male unreliability in matters of community importance. Upon further reflection, during the soup's final 10 minutes of cooking, I realized that there was no practical reason why Santa Claus must be portrayed by a male community member. The essential requirements for Santa duty, wearing a costume, interacting with children, and distributing gifts, could theoretically be performed by any community member regardless of gender. This realization led to the obvious conclusion that I should volunteer for Santa duties myself, as I was already coordinating all other aspects of Christmas celebration and was therefore most familiar with the requirements and expectations associated with the role. The soup was apparently finished cooking at the exact moment this conclusion was reached, which Mrs. Henderson interpreted as a sign that the decision was appropriate and timely. This interpretation reveals the kind of coincidence-based decision-making that characterized many aspects of rural American community organization in the 1840s. The quality of the soup itself requires additional analysis because Mrs. Henderson's decision-making may have been influenced by nutritional factors. Her description of the soup as adequate for sustenance purposes but uninspiring in terms of culinary achievement suggests that it provided sufficient nourishment to support clear thinking while not being so delicious as to distract from important considerations. The turnip soup's flavor profile, reconstructed from Mrs. Henderson's detailed recipe notes, would have been characterized by what modern food scientists might describe as earthy blandness with herbal undertones. This flavor combination was typical of rural American winter cooking, which emphasized practical nutrition over gastronomic pleasure. The soup's temperature at the time of consumption was recorded as appropriately warm, but not so hot as to require extended cooling periods. This temperature would have been ideal for contemplative eating, allowing Mrs. Henderson to focus on problem solving while consuming adequate nutrition. Mrs. Henderson's soup consumption patterns, as documented in her household journals, reveal that she typically ate lunch alone while reviewing various administrative tasks related to community organization. This solitary eating environment was conducive to the kind of focused thinking that led to innovative solutions like female Santa portrayal. The decision to become Santa herself was implemented through what Mrs. Henderson described as a systematic approach to gender-based holiday character adaptation. This approach involved solving several practical problems related to masculine Santa appearance, voice modification, and behavioral adjustment. The costume adaptation challenge was the most straightforward. The community's existing Santa suit, which had been sized for average adult male proportions, required alterations to accommodate Mrs. Henderson's significantly different body structure. These alterations were performed by Mrs. Henderson herself, using sewing skills she had developed through decades of family clothing maintenance. The alteration process required approximately 12 hours of work, spread over 4 days, during which Mrs. Henderson documented each modification in detail. Her alteration notes provide unprecedented insight into the technical challenges of cross-gender Santa costume adaptation. November 24th. Began suit modifications by adjusting torso dimensions. The original suit was designed for a chest measurement of approximately 42 inches, while my measurements require adjustment to 34 inches. This reduction was accomplished by removing excess fabric from the side seams and re-sewing with appropriate seam allowances. November 25th. Addressed sleeve length discrepancies. The original sleeves extended approximately 3 inches beyond my natural arm length, requiring shortening while maintaining the red fabric's pattern alignment. This adjustment was more complex than anticipated due to the need to preserve the white cuff trim proportions. November 26th. Modified pant leg dimensions and overall length. The original pants were designed for someone approximately 8 inches taller than me, requiring significant length adjustment and waist reduction. The excess fabric was preserved for potential future costume repairs. November 27th. Completed final fitting adjustments and tested costume mobility. The modified suit allows for adequate movement while maintaining recognizable Santa appearance. The padding distribution required recalibration to create appropriate masculine silhouette while ensuring comfort during extended wear periods. The voice modification challenge proved more complex than costume alteration. Mrs. Henderson's natural speaking voice was higher in pitch and different in tone than traditional Santa vocalizations. Developing a convincing masculine Santa voice required what she described as extensive vocal experimentation and practice. Her voice training methodology involved daily practice sessions lasting 15 to 20 minutes, during which she experimented with various techniques for lowering her vocal pitch and developing appropriate ho-ho-ho delivery. These practice sessions were conducted in her root cellar, where the acoustics provided feedback on voice projection while ensuring privacy from community observation. The voice training documentation reveals the systematic approach Mrs. Henderson applied to this challenge. November 25th, attempted basic pitch lowering by speaking from chest rather than throat. Results somewhat promising but require refinement. The ho-ho-ho delivery sounds artificial but recognizably Santa-like. November 26th, experimented with adding slight hoarseness to voice quality to mask feminine characteristics. This technique shows promise but requires practice to avoid sounding ill rather than jolly. November 27th, developed hybrid approach combining pitch lowering with modified speech patterns. The result approximates masculine Santa voice while remaining within my natural vocal capabilities. November 28th, achieved satisfactory Santa voice quality through combination of all previous techniques. The voice sounds convincingly Santa-like to my own ears, though actual effectiveness will require testing with community members. The behavioral adjustment challenge involved modifying Mrs. Henderson's natural mannerisms and movement patterns to conform to masculine Santa expectations. This required analysis of traditional masculine behavior patterns and practice in applying these patterns while wearing the Santa costume. Mrs. Henderson's behavioral modification notes document her systematic approach to masculine Santa persona development. Observed male community members to identify common masculine movement patterns, including broader shoulder positioning, longer stride length, and different hand gesturing styles. These patterns must be adapted for Santa character, while maintaining jolly, child-friendly demeanor. Practiced masculine sitting positions appropriate for Santa throne usage. Traditional feminine sitting positions are incompatible with Santa costume requirements and community expectations for Santa behavior. Developed masculine voice projection techniques for outdoor Christmas events. Santa must be heard clearly by all community members while maintaining appropriate jolly tone and masculine voice characteristics. The preparation process also required Mrs. Henderson to develop strategies for managing potential community resistance to female Santa portrayal. Her planning documents reveal careful consideration of possible objections and appropriate responses. Potential concern: community members may object to woman portraying traditionally male character. Response strategy: emphasize practical necessity due to absence of male volunteers and demonstrate competent Santa performance that meets community expectations. Potential concern: children may notice difference in Santa appearance from previous years. Response strategy: explain that Santa changes appearance slightly each year due to North Pole living conditions and workshop activities. Potential concern: religious community members may find female Santa inappropriate. Response strategy: emphasize Santa's role in bringing joy to children and maintaining Christmas traditions rather than focusing on gender aspects of performance. The documentation of Mrs. Henderson's Santa preparation reveals a level of systematic planning that was remarkable for its thoroughness and practical focus. Her approach demonstrated what modern organizational theorists would recognize as excellent project management skills applied to an unusual community challenge. By December 1st, Mrs. Henderson had completed all preparation activities and was ready to implement what her planning documents describe as Female Santa Pilot Program for Christmas 1845. The success or failure of this pilot program would determine not only the fate of Mediocrity Falls Christmas celebration, but also the future of community holiday organization in rural Pennsylvania. But before we examine the results of Mrs. Henderson's Santa debut, we need to analyze the broader implications of gender role modification in 19th century American community contexts. This analysis will require detailed examination of social expectations, cultural norms, and community power structures as they related to holiday celebrations. The gender implications of Mrs. Henderson's Santa decision extended far beyond simple costume wearing into questions about women's roles in community leadership and public performance. By volunteering to be Santa, Mrs. Henderson was challenging traditional assumptions about which community activities were appropriate for women and which were reserved for men. In 1845, rural Pennsylvania, community leadership roles were typically divided along gender lines, with men handling public responsibilities such as political organization and community representation, while women managed private responsibilities such as household coordination and family welfare. Holiday celebrations occupied an ambiguous position in this gender division, involving both public community elements and private family traditions. Santa Claus portrayal was traditionally considered a public community responsibility because it involved representing the entire community to its children and visitors. The role required authority, visibility, and symbolic leadership that were typically associated with masculine community positions. Mrs. Henderson's willingness to assume this role represented what sociologists might now recognize as an early example of gender role expansion in American communities. Her decision was based on practical rather than ideological considerations, but its implementation required challenging established social patterns. The community's reaction to female Santa candidacy was documented through various sources, including personal letters, diary entries, and meeting minutes from community organizations. These sources reveal a complex pattern of responses, ranging from enthusiastic support to cautious concern to outright opposition. Enthusiastic support came primarily from other women in the community who were involved in Christmas celebration organization. Margaret Henderson wrote to her cousin that Mother's Santa decision shows remarkable initiative and should be celebrated as an example of practical problem solving. Mrs. Pemberton noted in her diary that Mrs. Henderson's volunteering for Santa duty demonstrates the kind of community commitment that puts our menfolk to shame. Cautious concern was expressed primarily by community members who worried about the precedent that female Santa portrayal might establish. Mr. Wilkins wrote to his brother that, while Mrs. Henderson is certainly capable, I worry about what other traditional roles might be assumed by women if we allow this change. Dr. Prosaic noted in his medical journal that female Santa portrayal may have unpredictable effects on community social organization. Outright opposition was limited but vocal. The Reverend Blansworth expressed concerns about the appropriateness of women assuming roles traditionally performed by men, particularly roles involving public performance and community representation. However, his opposition was tempered by recognition that no male community members had volunteered for Santa duty. The debate over female Santa acceptability was complicated by the practical reality that Christmas was approaching rapidly and no alternative solutions had been identified. Community members who had philosophical objections to female Santa portrayal were forced to choose between compromising their principles or canceling Christmas celebration entirely. This choice between imperfect solution and no solution created what Mrs. Henderson's correspondence describes as a practical consensus that female Santa was preferable to no Santa. This consensus was achieved not through philosophical agreement, but through elimination of alternatives. The formation of practical consensus around female Santa acceptance demonstrates how community decision-making in small rural towns often prioritized practical outcomes over theoretical consistency. The community's willingness to accept Mrs. Henderson's Santa candidacy reflected their commitment to maintaining Christmas traditions, even when those traditions required modification of other social conventions. Mrs. Henderson's Santa training period also revealed interesting patterns in how communities adapted to social change. Rather than discussing the broader implications of female Santa portrayal, most community members focused on practical questions such as whether Mrs. Henderson could perform Santa duties adequately and whether children would accept her performance as authentic. This focus on practical rather than theoretical concerns allowed the community to implement social change without requiring explicit acknowledgement that social change was occurring. Community members could support Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance while maintaining that they were simply solving a practical problem rather than challenging gender roles. The practical focus also allowed individuals with different philosophical views about women's roles to reach agreement on the specific question of Christmas 1845 Santa portrayal. Supporters and skeptics could collaborate on ensuring successful Christmas celebration while avoiding broader discussions about gender and community leadership. Mrs. Henderson's own approach to her Santa role reflected this practical focus. Her preparation documents consistently framed Santa portrayal as a community service activity rather than a statement about women's capabilities or rights. This framing allowed her to assume the role without explicitly challenging community members who might have objected to more direct approaches to gender role expansion. The success of this practical approach to social change would depend ultimately on the quality of Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance and the community's reaction to that performance. If her Santa portrayal was successful, it would establish precedent for women assuming traditionally masculine community roles. If unsuccessful, it might reinforce existing gender role boundaries. But we're not quite ready to examine Mrs. Henderson's Santa debut yet. First, we need to analyze the historical context of gender role modification in American communities during the 1840s, which was a period of significant social change related to women's roles in public life. The 1840s marked the beginning of what historians call the women's rights movement in American society. Though this movement had limited impact on rural communities like Mediocrity Falls, most rural women in the 1840s were primarily focused on practical family and community concerns rather than broader questions about women's legal or political rights. However, practical necessities often led to informal expansion of women's community roles even in conservative rural areas. Women frequently assumed responsibilities for community organization, education, and social services when men were unavailable or unwilling to take on these tasks. Mrs. Henderson's assumption of Santa duties fits this pattern of practical role expansion driven by community necessity rather than ideological commitment to gender equality. Her decision was motivated by Christmas celebration requirements rather than by desire to challenge traditional gender roles. The practical approach to gender role expansion was often more effective than ideological approaches in conservative communities because it avoided direct confrontation with established beliefs while achieving functional changes in social organization. Communities could accept women in expanded roles while maintaining theoretical commitment to traditional gender divisions. Mrs. Henderson's Santa candidacy represented what sociologists might recognize as stealth feminism, the achievement of expanded women's roles through practical problem-solving rather than direct advocacy for women's rights. This approach allowed communities to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining social stability. The effectiveness of stealth feminism in rural American communities during the 1840s was demonstrated by the gradual expansion of women's community roles throughout the decade. Women increasingly took on responsibilities for education, community organization, and social services, often without explicit recognition that these role expansions represented significant social change. Mrs. Henderson's Santa experience would either reinforce or challenge this pattern of gradual role expansion, depending on how successfully she performed Santa duties and how positively the community responded to her performance. We're now approaching the moment when we'll finally examine Mrs. Henderson's actual Santa performance and its reception by the Mediocrity Falls community. This examination will reveal whether practical feminism could successfully challenge traditional holiday gender roles in conservative rural American communities. But before we get to that climactic moment, we need to take a brief detour through the fascinating topic of costume construction techniques in pre-industrial American society, because nothing maintains narrative momentum quite like detailed analysis of 19th century sewing methods. And so we arrive at December 22nd, 1845, the day of Mrs. Henderson's Santa debut. If you're still watching this video at the 1 hour and 45-minute mark, you represent approximately 0.01% of humanity. Congratulations on your remarkable commitment to consuming content about 19th century holiday costume logistics. Your persistence raises profound questions about the nature of human attention spans and the mysterious appeal of deliberately boring narratives. But before we examine Mrs. Henderson's historic Santa performance, I feel compelled to acknowledge the existential absurdity of what we're doing here. We have spent nearly 2 hours discussing the minutiae of a Christmas celebration that occurred 178 years ago in a town that no longer exists, involving people whose names no one remembers, addressing a problem that solved itself within 24 hours. This raises the obvious question: why are we here? Why are you still watching? What psychological or spiritual need is being fulfilled by this extended examination of holiday-related tedium? The answer, of course, is that there is no answer. We are here because we are here, watching because we are watching, continuing because continuation has become its own purpose. This video has transcended its original purpose of documenting Santa-related difficulties and has become a meditation on the human capacity to persist in activities that serve no discernible function. But let us continue, because continuation is all we have left. Mrs. Henderson's Santa debut took place at 4 p.m. on December 22nd in the Mediocrity Falls Community Center, a building that was described in contemporary accounts as adequately sized for community gatherings but uninspiring in architectural terms. The building seated approximately 47 people on wooden benches, arranged in rows that were reasonably straight but not particularly comfortable. The audience for Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance consisted of 32 adults, 17 children, and 2 infants who were probably not paying attention to anything in particular. This represents a turnout of approximately 73% of the total community population, which was considered satisfactory for a December evening event in rural Pennsylvania. The performance began with what Mrs. Henderson's preparation notes describe as standard Santa entrance procedures. This involved her walking through the main door while saying "ho ho ho" in the masculine voice she had practiced for 2 weeks. Contemporary accounts describe this entrance as recognizably Santa-like but somewhat unexpected in vocal quality. Little Susie Pemberton, age 7, was recorded as saying "Santa sounds different this year" to her mother, who responded, "Santa's voice changes depending on North Pole weather conditions." This explanation was apparently accepted by Susie and repeated to other children, creating what community historians have never called the weather-based Santa voice explanation phenomenon. Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance lasted approximately 47 minutes and included traditional Santa activities, such as asking children about their behavior during the past year, listening to gift requests, and distributing presents that had been prepared by the Christmas Celebration Committee. Her performance was documented in unprecedented detail by several community members who maintained written records for reasons that remain unclear. The most comprehensive account comes from Professor Dreary, who attended the performance as part of his ongoing research into community holiday celebration dynamics in rural American settings. His research notes provide minute-by-minute documentation of Mrs. Henderson's Santa activities. 4:02 p.m. Santa, Mrs. Henderson, established seating position on prepared throne, wooden chair with red cushion. Posture appeared appropriately Santa-like with adequate jolly demeanor maintenance. 4:04 p.m. First child approached Santa for interaction. Child appeared to accept Santa's authenticity without visible skepticism. Conversation proceeded according to traditional Santa-child interaction patterns. 4:07 p.m. Santa's ho-ho-ho delivery maintained consistency with practiced masculine voice techniques. No obvious vocal irregularities detected by adult audience members. 4:12 p.m. Santa demonstrated adequate knowledge of individual children's names and general behavioral patterns. Preparation activities appeared to have been effective. 4:18 p.m. Gift distribution procedures executed smoothly. Santa maintained appropriate jolly enthusiasm throughout repetitive gift-giving activities. Professor Dreary's notes continue in this manner for the entire performance, documenting what he concludes was a Santa performance that met community expectations while introducing minor variations in voice and mannerism that were within acceptable parameters for Santa portrayal. The children's reactions to Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance were overwhelmingly positive. Post-performance interviews conducted by Margaret Henderson, for reasons of personal curiosity rather than academic research, revealed that children found the Santa experience satisfactory and appropriately Christmas-like. Sample child feedback included: Santa was good. He gave me a wooden top. Timothy Youngster, age 8. Santa remembered that I helped my mother with chores. That was nice. Emily Adequate, age 6. Santa's beard looked real. I wanted to touch it, but mother said not to. James Barely Interested, age 9. The adult reactions were more complex and revealed the community's underlying tensions about gender roles and holiday traditions. Adult feedback ranged from enthusiastic approval to grudging acceptance to philosophical confusion about the implications of female Santa portrayal. Mrs. Pemberton wrote in her diary that Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance was entirely adequate and perhaps superior to some previous Santa portrayals by community men. The children seemed satisfied, and the Christmas celebration proceeded without difficulties. Mr. Wilkins noted in a letter to his brother that our Christmas Santa situation was resolved through Mrs. Henderson's volunteering, though I remain uncertain about the long-term implications of women assuming traditionally masculine community roles. Dr. Prosaic recorded in his medical journal that the female Santa phenomenon appears to have no negative psychological effects on community children, though further observation may be warranted to assess potential impacts on traditional gender role understanding. The Reverend Blansworth's reaction was documented in his weekly sermon notes. The Christmas celebration proceeded appropriately and brought joy to our community's children. The methods by which this joy was achieved, while unconventional, serve the greater purpose of Christian celebration and community fellowship. The overall community assessment of Mrs. Henderson's Santa performance was positive, with most residents agreeing that she had successfully fulfilled the essential requirements of Santa duty while maintaining appropriate Christmas celebration standards. The performance was considered successful enough that Mrs. Henderson was invited to continue as Community Santa for Christmas 1846. However, this invitation became irrelevant when 3 different male community members volunteered for Santa duty in 1846, apparently motivated by what Dr. Prosaic theorized was competitive response to successful female performance of traditionally masculine community role. The return of male Santa volunteers in 1846 ended Mrs. Henderson's Santa career after a single performance, making her one of the shortest tenured Santa performers in documented American Christmas history. Her Santa legacy was preserved primarily through Professor Dreary's research notes and various community members' personal correspondence. The broader implications of the 1845 Santa crisis were minimal and quickly forgotten. Within 5 years, no one in Mediocrity Falls regularly discussed the year when Mrs. Henderson was Santa, and the event was remembered primarily as the Christmas when we had Santa troubles but everything worked out. This rapid forgetting of what seemed like a significant community event reveals the essentially ephemeral nature of small-town crises. Problems that feel overwhelming while occurring often become merely amusing anecdotes within a few years, assuming they are remembered at all. The Santa crisis of 1845 achieved its primary objective, ensuring that Mediocrity Falls had Christmas celebration with appropriate Santa representation, while having no lasting impact on community organization, gender roles, or holiday traditions. It was a perfect example of a problem that solved itself while being solved. Mrs. Henderson returned to her normal community activities after Christmas 1845 and never again volunteered for holiday character portrayal. Her Santa costume was donated to the community for future use, though it required extensive alterations when male volunteers resumed Santa duties in subsequent years. The 17 people introduced at the beginning of this narrative continued their lives of appropriate mediocrity. Cornelius Blandworth III maintained his recreational staring practice until 1847, when he developed an interest in recreational sitting that occupied the remainder of his life. Professor Dreary completed his study of community holiday dynamics in 1849, concluding that rural Christmas celebrations generally proceed according to predictable patterns with minor variations that have no lasting significance. The button shortage that had supposedly contributed to the Santa crisis was resolved in 1846 when Bottonius Maximus ended his retirement and resumed button manufacturing for 6 additional months before retiring permanently to to pursue professional sitting full-time. And what of the one object that survived every chapter of this story? The object I promised to reveal at the end. It was Mrs. Henderson's soup ladle, the spoon she used to stir the turnip soup while making her historic decision to become Santa. This ladle was passed down through her family for 3 generations before being lost in a house fire in 1923, taking with it the last physical remnant of the Great Santa Crisis of 1845. Now, before we conclude this epic journey into festive mediocrity, I want to introduce you to something special and appropriately boring. You see, the spirit of our dear Mrs. Henderson and all the wonderfully unremarkable residents of Mediocrity Falls lives on in our limited edition boring Christmas calendar, featuring none other than Sleepsy Noel, our endearingly dull Christmas mascot. This isn't just any calendar. This is 31 days of perfectly adequate Christmas expressions from Sleepsy Noel, each one carefully designed to be just interesting enough to notice, but not so interesting as to disrupt your peaceful holiday routine. Each day features a different easy expression, from mildly festive Tuesday to appropriately jolly but not excessively so Sunday. For centuries, people have been overwhelmed by Christmas. Too much excitement, too much joy, too much muchness. But what if Christmas could be different? What if it could be perfectly, wonderfully ordinary? Sleepsy Noel understands that not every Christmas moment needs to be magical. Sometimes you just need a holiday companion who appreciates the beauty of adequacy, the charm of sufficient cheer, and the peaceful satisfaction of celebrations that are exactly as festive as they need to be. No more, no less. This calendar is available for a limited time only. Why limited time? Because even adequately boring things must eventually end, and scarcity makes things seem more important than they actually are. Each calendar features Sleepsy Noel's signature expressions of moderate holiday enthusiasm, printed on paper that is neither glossy nor matte, but somewhere perfectly in between. The link is in the comments below, pinned for your convenience. Order now, or don't. Sleepsy Noel will be equally content either way, which is exactly the kind of non-pressured Christmas spirit we could all use more of. And so we reach the end of our 2-hour journey through the most thoroughly documented non-crisis in Christmas history. We have examined the lives of 17 irrelevant people, analyzed the cultural implications of holiday costume shortages, and witnessed the historic moment when Mrs. Henderson served soup and accidentally revolutionized Christmas celebration in Mediocrity Falls, Pennsylvania. What have we learned from this extended examination of 19th century holiday logistics? Perhaps that problems often solve themselves. Perhaps that community crises are rarely as significant as they seem. Perhaps that the details of daily life, no matter how mundane, become fascinating when examined with sufficient attention and inappropriate seriousness. Or perhaps we have learned nothing at all, which would be entirely appropriate for a video dedicated to the celebration of purposeful meaninglessness. The small Christmas detail I mentioned at the beginning. It was the fact that Mrs. Henderson's Santa beard was made from cotton that had been dyed white, using a process that involved boiling it with crushed holly berries, making it literally a Christmas-colored beard. You probably didn't notice because it was buried in paragraph 47 of the costume modification section. If you made it to the end of this video, you are part of an extraordinarily small group of humans who have voluntarily consumed 2 hours of content about Santa recruitment difficulties in a town that ceased to exist in 1847. This achievement qualifies you for membership in the International Society of People Who Watch Boring Videos to the End, an organization that exists primarily in theory and has no practical benefits whatsoever. Liking this video won't make it more interesting, but we appreciate the irony. Subscribing won't give you access to better content, but it will demonstrate your commitment to the pursuit of deliberately tedious entertainment. And with that, we conclude our epic tale of Christmas mediocrity. Mrs. Henderson returned to her soup. The children of Mediocrity Falls received their adequately disappointing Christmas gifts, and somewhere in the vast expanse of American history, a minor holiday crisis was resolved through practical problem-solving and expired immediately into well-deserved obscurity. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of festive boredom. May your own Christmas celebrations achieve levels of appropriateness that would make Mrs. Henderson proud. Remember, that limited edition boring Christmas calendar with Sleepsy Noel is waiting for you in the comments. because nothing says happy holidays quite like 31 days of deliberately underwhelming Christmas cheer. Until next time. If there is a next time, which there probably won't be because who would voluntarily create a sequel to this? This has been your guide through the wonderland of Christmas adequacy. Good day, or adequate day, or whatever level of day quality seems appropriate for your current circumstances.